stand, an army of crazed, flesh-starved things that used to be people, battering down his fortified office door, tearing him to shreds, leaving just enough of his chewed carcass to become one of them, whatever they were. He had always expected to die young and violently, but not like this, and certainly not by his own hand. Eric appreciated the bitter irony. He had been the father of this atrocity. That he should fall victim to it would have been hysterical if it weren't him. Now here he sat at his desk in his windowless basement office. All he had was a syringe of the awful mixture he had set loose on the world, and a choice. Eric had only lasted this long because of the door. He had it installed in anticipation of needing to protect himself from one of the many drug dealers with whom he had entered into an uneasy partnership over the years. He sold their drugs for them in his club. As skillful and efficient as he was at moving narcotics to the addled metalheads who frequented the place, he was even better at skimming profit far above his agreed-upon percentage. His erstwhile partners were getting wise to the scam. The grumblings had begun. With that in mind, Eric had the 4-ply titanium fire door put in. It was more vault than anything else. He was assured by the contractor the door would withstand all manner of explosives, rocket-propelled grenades, and any handheld missile currently available on the black market. But Eric knew it would be just a matter of time before the horde of berserkers presently outside would finally accomplish what explosives and weaponry could not. Eric Funchman had been called Eric the Red since he was 10 years old. His father, Irwin, a criminal with his dirty fingers in all manner of quasi-legitimate businesses, gave Eric the name. It started to take hold before anyone knew the reason for the appellation. Why Eric the Red, Tovar Burrell, a former Mossad agent and Irwin's hired muscle, asked. It's not like you guys are Vikings. You're Bronx Jews, not a Nordic raiding party. Scary enough if you ask me, but why not something snappy in Hebrew or Yiddish? I call him Eric the Red because he's always in a foul mood, Irwin said. He's the most unpleasant boy I ever encountered. More's the pity he's mine. I still don't get the red part, because he's always on the rag. Oh, that makes sense. In fact, Eric was not always on the rag. He had extreme difficulty expressing himself to others. As such, he was awkward around people almost to the point of paralysis. He wanted desperately to interact pleasantly with others, but his facial expressions and deadpan demeanor would not allow him to communicate his better intentions. Eric had done a lot of work over the years to combat his forbidding appearance, but all his attempts to counter it only exacerbated the problem and put him further out on the island where he had no desire to be. A year after his mother passed away, when Eric was 10 years old, his father brought him to a psychiatrist. He was hoping for a diagnosis which would allow him to have his son declared incompetent and commit him to an institution to be rid of him. The psychiatrist, referred by an associate, didn't understand this was supposed to be a formality. The doctor undertook a painstaking and rigorous examination. His diagnosis was Asperger's syndrome. When Irwin explained the setup as he understood it, Dr. Amalfitano scoffed at him. My diagnosis is based on the medical evidence and symptoms your son evinces. I'm not fudging my findings just so you can dump him in a mental hospital for the rest of his life. But Tony Skaggs told me you would do the right thing, Irwin argued. I just did it. Tony Skaggs is my uncle. I see people he refers to me as a favor. But he understands I will not tailor my diagnoses, nor will I prescribe drugs which aren't medically needed. Many of Tony's associates come in here with the wrong idea. They get sent away just like you. I can help you with your son, but I'm not taking him off your hands to you. What the fuck is wrong with him then, Irwin demanded. He has high-functioning form of autism. His social awkwardness and inability to modulate his voice coincide with his facial expressions, prevents him from communicating with others very well, the doctor explained. So he's a retard? No, quite the opposite. He's actually brilliant. But until he learns to function socially, he'll never be able to utilize it. What do we do about it? The doctor went on to describe a rigorous plan of counseling, occupational and physical therapy, and drugs to combat the anxiety brought on by the awkwardness. Irwin thought it would have been easier to just burn the doctor's office to the ground, destroying his precious medical records and finding another shrink willing to play ball. But he was prevented from doing so. Irwin Funchman was the second scariest gangster in Youngstown, Ohio. Tony Skaggs and Amalfitano had him beat by a mile. There was no way Irwin was going to start a war with Tony by messing with his nephew. He could sense the little prick doctor knew it too. The The treatment prescribed helped Eric to be able to communicate with others and to begin to use his outsized intellect. His father didn't like him any better, but as he grew, Erwin started to find uses for the boy. While he was able to communicate with others, he made no progress with respect to putting people at ease. If anything, his therapy and training further alienated them. To combat Eric's clumsiness, when the training began, he started learning mixed martial arts and lifting weights, because autism sufferers tend to fixate on rituals and routines. The training took on an almost religious seal. The fact he was big already made it all look frightening. He countered his impulse not to make eye contact with others by simply forcing himself to do it. This force of will, coupled with his expressionless mask of the face and his deadpan demeanor, made eye contact look and feel like a glare. He never figured out what to do with his hands when he spoke, so he would push his chest out and throw his shoulders back. He would leave his hands at his side, but to keep them there, he clenched them into giant balled fists. It appeared to everyone he was one cross word away from killing them. With his massive chest and shoulders like bowling balls, his aspect was terrifying. Eric's low, raspy voice, delivered from deep within, didn't help matters at all. It made everything sound like a demand, rather than the polite request he intended. The monotone words, without inflection or emphasis, on their best day sounded like sarcasm. On every other day, they sounded like the portent of doom. Given these unintended consequences, it wasn't long before Erwin dropped to number 3 on Youngstown's scary gangster list. Tony Skaggs was still nominally recognized as number 1, but this was more out of respect and tradition than reality. No one was betting on Tony if Eric ever decided to challenge him. His father chose Eric to run his most lucrative but volatile business venture, an erstwhile dance hall and saloon. In short order, Eric informed his father he was taking the club. Erwin was no longer in a position to argue. The toxic shock syndrome was a rave hall and exotic dancing emporium fronting an enormous narcotics distribution operation, which is a polite way of saying it was the amoral epicenter of Ohio. Tucked all the way out on the McGuffey Road, near the county line, the place was the perfect cover for all manner of criminal behavior. And if you had a sin you'd like to commit, or a form of self-abasement you hadn't yet tried, the toxic shock syndrome would afford you ample opportunity. The strippers were drug-addicted prostitutes. They also sold the drugs for Eric. The transactions all looked legal. Buyers would appear to be paying for lap dances. They would get a lap dance, along with their purchase of narcotics being slipped into their pockets. It seemed like a flawless operation, and it was for a while. But Eric was his father's son. He had been taught to skim everything since he was young. So he skimmed. Every parcel of narcotics coming into the club to be sold would be automatically cut with 1/3 of its weight in lactose powder. Eric did all the cutting and rebagging. The autistic are creatures of habit. Once Eric started cutting the drugs, it wasn't long before it was what he had to do. To keep him functional and in his comfort zone, no matter what else happened, Eric cut the drugs. It was this attention to detail and habit which would ultimately slide the world out of its comfort zone and into a worldwide pandemic. When the professor showed up, Eric's operation was already in full swing. He was making more money than he could ever spend, but he was never averse to making more. Counting money was a comfort to him. So when the tall, creepy man made his business proposition, Eric was all ears. The vibe of impending disaster, which was coursing through Eric's body at the moment, was not communicated in his face or body language. No one else knew he was suddenly afraid. Eric suppressed his initial revulsion to the professor and listened to his deal. The professor really was a professor. He had taught biochemistry at Ohio State University for 30 years. He became bored after he retired and started messing with the kind of chemistry the university never would have permitted. He would become known in the organized crime world as a synthetic drug manufacturer. His motivations were much darker than narcotics, though. What he was creating wasn't a drug at all. It was a nerve agent. He called his creation cornucopia and instead insisted it be marketed as such. What the chemical compound did when injected was to simulate the initial high of a heroin shot, coupled with the adrenaline rush of a methamphetamine hit, encased in the general warm, encompassing feeling of euphoria and well-being one gets from that first line of cocaine. Eric immediately recognized the limitless earning potential of this product. A drug with those properties sold itself. His only question was, would its allure guarantee repeat sales? Is it addictive, Eric asked. Instantly. One shot of cornucopia ensures the user will need another shot every single day, the professor said. How do we sell it? It's a powder. We sell it in gem paper in exact doses. The user cooks it with distilled water. There are no impurities, so we have removed the tedious need to strain it through cotton, like they do with their dirty brown tar heroin. They just load the syringe from their spoons, and they are, as they say, good to go. With the built-in demand to such a product, Eric knew it wouldn't be long before every drunkie, west of the Appalachians and east of the Rockies, would be banging at his door just to get some, and they would be back for more every day thereafter. I'm in, Eric said. Yes, of course you are, but before I agree to sell to you, understand this compound cannot be cut or adulterated in any way. The dosage is precise. Any attempt to dilute it will have catastrophic results. You understand? Yeah, sure, Eric intoned, already factoring his inflated profit by 1/3. The professor sensed as much and was secretly delighted. He had engineered this chemical as a weapon. He was going to sell it to the military, but declined to do so because he knew they wouldn't have the courage to use it. This was his baby. He wanted it introduced to the world. So he went back into his lab and engineered the compound with a blocking enzyme to thwart the full and secretly intended effect. He had heard rumors about Eric's practice of stepping on his drugs. This is why the professor sought him out as his distributor. He was counting on it. The professor had engineered the enzyme to be blunted when simple sugar molecules adhered to it. Eric's preferred cutting agent for powders was lactose, pure milk sugar. Once the sugar removed the blocking enzyme, cornucopia did what it was originally intended. It attacked the brain, which instantly triggered the pituitary gland and put every other gland in the body into overdrive. In an instant, the user felt the effects of enormous quantities of testosterone, adrenaline, growth hormone, and insulin coursing through their bloodstreams, with all of the inherent aggression and nervous energy. At the same time, the outer half of the adrenal cortex started pumping enormous amounts of cortisol. This triggered the body's fight or flight impulse, except with this particular nerve agent, there was no longer a flight option. The user became a crazed hormone-binging dynamo of violence. The aggression stayed in check momentarily until the compound could deplete the serotonin levels in the brain to zero. Once that happened, the ability to reason was gone. Like a switch being flipped, what was left was a superhuman turbocharged killing machine with no other impulse but to destroy or murder. Then there was the bad news. Once a user of cornucopia either bit, spit, or bled on another person, that person was instantly affected. The victim's insatiable need to attack guaranteed the rapid spread of the infected in every direction. This is how a miserable hole in the wall in Ohio became ground zero for the apocalypse that would eradicate the human race. As Eric the Red Funchman sat at his desk, watching his impregnable door start to give way behind the crush of the berserker horde, he gave some thought to how he would meet his end. He had a syringe of the adulterated cornucopia. He reasoned he could just wait for the door to go down and be consumed by the throng, thus becoming one of them. Or he thought he could just inject the drug and join the Armageddon he created under his own terms. As he jammed the syringe into the side of his neck and drove home the plunger, he thought, for once I won't feel awkward around my peers.